Very warm welcome to you on a slightly chilly evening with a little breeze that's just picked up. My name is Fiona and I'm delighted that so many of you are here to celebrate the publication of Graham Perrett's The Long Story, A Personal Journey Through International Relations in Australia. So my job is to do some housekeeping and then I'm going to introduce our MC for the evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Yagara and Turrbal, and pay all of our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our MC for the evening, this is Lee OAM, who is a community advocate, particularly for the Australian Chinese community, including being an advocate for a memorial to Chinese families in St. George, and also the citizen. Sorry, I put my glasses on. I've got to that age where my glasses go up and down and up and down. And also to the Chinese military personnel in Sunnybank. So it's a great honour and a pleasure to have Lewis Lee as our MC. Please welcome both Lewis and of course our author for the night, Graham Perrett.
Thank you, Fiona. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the book launch of The Long Story at the Avid Reader here. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owner of the land on which the gathering is taking place, the Yagara people and Jagara people, on which acknowledge the Yukon people whose land cover north of Logan River up to the foothill Toowoomba Range, and who have taken care of this country for thousands of generations. I also acknowledge the Turrbal people, the traditional custodian of the land and water of the Brisbane area, stretched from Elizabeth Creek south to Logan River inland as far as Mogul. I also pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all elders, whatever their cultural background, and have now chosen to call this country home. Ladies and gentlemen, let me as Fiona mentioned earlier, I'm actually the honorary advisor to the St. George Chinese Community Memorial Monument. We just come back from St. George. I went there on the 14th of July, 15th of July. We come back on 16th July. Why we went there? Because there's a memorial called Avid Memorial. Between 1848 to 1853, there are 300 Avid went to Darling Down, look after 450,000 sheep. And this memorial is to honor their contribution to this country. You'll find that there's a photo of the memorial in the middle, color in the middle of this book. I'm going to disclose that, Grant. And we did the fourth rededication on the 15th of July at St. George Graveyard. So we travel 509 kilometers away from Brisbane and come back. You know, it needs 7 hours to go there, come back, and then 14 hours drive. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our author, Graham Perrett, born in St. George, Queensland. Graham Perrett is a politician representing the seat of Moulton. Perrett has a strong sense of justice and morality, has studied law at the Queensland University of Technology. He's continuously campaigned for the rights of those underprivileged. Perrett had previously published novels. The 12 Fish, I remember that in 2008, I mentioned to Fiona, this was the rainforest here. I think the stage is on that side. There's a little change for better, by the way. Better, 庄名是有 Chinese called better feng shui. And I mentioned about publish the 12 Fish, and second book is The Big Fish, and the third book is Solid Rocks. This is the fourth book. I think start from 2019. Took Graham 4 or 5 years nearly to write this book. So ladies and gentlemen, why don't we invite Grant to talk about this book? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Grant Perrett.
I also acknowledge the traditional owners and thank them for their strong and continuing stewardship, and give apologies for Wayne, who had intended to be here tonight but has the flu, and that horrible flu that seems to be going around at the moment. Unfortunately, Wayne doesn't get thrown in to Avid Reader for his. We did have a bit of a launch out in St George at the pub, which was pretty good. But great to be here, and thank you, Fiona, for letting us in. So the long story is many things. First and foremost, it is Wayne Long's story. Wayne lived it, Wayne spoke it, and I helped writing that story. But it's also telling that greater story of the Chinese diaspora, that the first Chinese person to walk down a gangplank that we know of was 1818. Arguably, there might have been other Chinese footsteps in Australia before then. Certainly, some suggestion that there was trading taking place between Yolngu people in the northern parts of Australia, goods that would have made their way back to the Middle Kingdom, maybe even back into the Forbidden Palace. So, Lewis, I wanted to help tell that story. I represent an electorate that has a large number of people who speak Mandarin. Some of them come from Malaysia, yes. Lewis is a Malaysian Chinese person that came to Australia to study Greek. That's another book. But some come from the Middle Kingdom, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Indonesia. Yes, so many different people that have made that journey to Australia. Now over 1 million Australians have that connection back to the Middle Kingdom. Some 2 years old, 2 weeks old, or 200 years old. All sorts of stories. So Wayne is one of those with those connections, and Wayne is particularly interesting because the Long family, he is one of 8 children. I'm one of 10 children, and I note that my sister is here. The person who lives closest to the launch tonight was the last one in. I just do want to point that out. I thank all of those people that have made the long journey to come along, and many with those connections back to St George. So Wayne is someone I went to school with, played footy with, good friends with, got into a bit of mischief with. Nothing that would interest the police now, I'm pretty sure. And telling Wayne's story, Wayne is the device to tell that greater story of that connection between Australians of Chinese heritage, our First Nations people, the oldest continuous culture on earth, the oldest words on earth, the First Nations, and then intertwining that with the people from the Middle Kingdom. It just was a story I wanted to tell, Lewis.
George graveyard, and he actually laid the wreaths or lighting the candle to honor those we call Amichiford at that memorial that we unveiled on the 30th of March 2019. So this is the 4th year rededication.
So those shepherds from Amoy, which is Guangzhou, southern China, often they came out in the 1830s, 1840s as not indentured, but they ended up and often didn't make enough money to go back to China, back to their families, and so often ended up in relationships with First Nations people because they couldn't afford to go home, and sometimes they were excluded from townships outside the boundaries. And so many of those stories throughout Australia, in Broome, Cairns, Darwin, everywhere you go throughout Australia, there's often that connection. And the great contributions, including that, saving so many townships from scurvy because they were such great market gardeners, they would be able to give some fresh fruit and veggies to go with the meat and pickled pork and all that sort of thing.
That's right. Talk about talk about the cover. The cover tells that the long story is co-written by you and Wayne Long. whose voice is the loudest in this book? Can you share with us? I know you say Wayne is the one who talked about it. You wrote for him.
I'd like to think it is Wayne's voice that is the loudest, but Wayne and I were in different English classes at school. Wayne is, for those that know Wayne, there's a few chairs in the front row, guys, if you want to be embarrassed right down the front. Wayne's a pretty laconic sort of guy, was a great sporting hero, lived by a moral code, I would suggest, that I think you will see in the writing. So I wanted to make sure his voice was heard, but I am a writer. I do have a day job as a politician, but I'm dedicated to creating his story truthfully, but obviously that involves making decisions. What do I write down? What do I not write down? How truthfully do I write down the words that came out of his mouth? And I did that 100% accurately, even sometimes when I did not want to, because he's a friend first. And whilst he said, yeah, basically you're an idiot if you want to write my story, but he trusted me enough with his life story and his family story, because the Longs are intertwined with the Perretts. We've all went to school with them. We know their, we know their story. So I wanted to make sure his voice was heard, but he's not Superman or Batman. He's Wayne Long in all that entails. I mean, he's my hero, but he's also a flawed hero.
Actually, dragon in Chinese. So is that long as dragon? Long?
Well, we come from, we were dragons. When we were kids, they briefly ran out of people to play footy against, so they divided the town in half on one street, and one side were saints and the other side were dragons. So we were dragons. We didn't talk to those saints, with all respect to the saints that are here. But so there is an interconnection, obviously, and even in so many other ways, the First Nation stories, some of the creation stories are not dissimilar. I mean, the area that I represent in Sunnybank, people say it's the heart of the dragon, with the dragon being the Brisbane River, in terms of, I don't know whether that was just a clever real estate agent. We'd made a lot of money out of it. But that story of the dragon is something that is woven through many, St. George is named after the fact that it was on St. George's Day that Sir Thomas Mitchell discovered a place full of people.
So there is a dragon festival. And in 2017, the current deputy mayor, the councillor Robin Furmeister, rang me out in beginning of September, asking me where can I borrow a dragon costume with 8 people doing the running around, dancing with the dragon, because she ordered online and the product didn't arrive yet, so she was panicking. I said, give me 5 minutes. So I rang out friends called Melody Cheng from War Arts and Multiculture, and we gave her a dragon, borrow a dragon using courier straight to St. George the following day. And I promised her at the time, I say, we'll give you a new 8 people costume dragon, new one, on the 30th of March 2019. And we did deliver that.
If you need a dragon, Lewis Lee can do many, many things. 57. So Lewis laughs at the same joke 57 times. And I always say, you need to find a First Nations word that you can use back to your original country, and because that word is a special word for you, because you're connected here now.
That's right.
And you can see some people wandering in their thongs, sort of, they have to go through the citizenship ceremony, but the ceremony sweeps them up, very well planned by Lewis Lee, but it sweeps them up, and you can see by the end of it that they are so proud to be connected.
Of course.
Back 15 1,500 generations back into this place. It's a wonderful thing.
One more question. I get to know Wayne in 2017. Why I went there first time on 2017, and second time I went there 2018, and third time I went there is 2019, where we unveiled the Shepherd Memorial.
Sorry, I should just point out, Lewis has a photographic memory for calendars and everything. So, if you introduce yourself tonight, he will remember you. Sorry, Lewis.
So in terms of, so I went 4 times. Due to COVID during 2021, 2022, we would come to St. George. So we went to this time. This is the 4th time I went to St. George for the 4th rededication. Grant, how long have you been knowing Wayne?
Well, I'm 57, so I reckon I would have known him from when I was 4 or 5. We would have played footy together in junior rugby league, and his family used to walk past our place. And I think when I was 5, my dad left and moved 2 doors down from Wayne's place, which was just around the corner. So, my family and the Long family, pretty much like the Perrett family, big families in country, in a small country town. You all are connected in some way. There's probably four of us, a guy called John Kennedy, and another guy that some of you might know from rugby league called Dale Shearer, and who was played rugby league for Queensland and Australia, and so we would sort of hang out together and do mischief as 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds, I suppose, and from always been close since then. Not going on holidays together, but always catching up, and sadly, for those that know the story, that often via tragedy.
Thank you, Graham. And also, how did you and Wayne put this book together?
Yeah, well,
any influence from the publisher called Dan Kelly?
That's my publisher at the back, so I feel like I'm on show here. But the crafting the book was different. Fiction is much easier to write. It's just being a politician, I just steal from the people I meet. They always give me some good lines that I can work or steal or rework. With Wayne, it had to be true. It had to be the words that came out of his mouth or the other people that I interviewed. And weaving, I didn't know the narrative. Well, I knew much of the story, but I didn't know the directions it was going to go. So it was just literally recording either Wayne live over the phone or in front of him. A lot of it was over the phone. He's a farm worker who often drives cotton harvesters up and down, or does work where he can sort of let the machine go, and so we'd often do recordings when he was doing that.
I said, who come up with the idea? What is the inspiration?
Well, one of those trips this would have been 16 or 17. I remember going out to St. George. There was a diplomatic representative that wanted to see a bit of the real Australia, and I said, well, that's St. George. So took him out, and then Robert Buchan, a former mayor, told the story of when we were out there, how back in the 70s when someone had the bright idea to clean up the St. George Cemetery.
Which is right in front on the left-hand side, facing north.
Yeah, so it is.
The reason why I say facing north is because China is on the northern hemisphere. So when we designed this memorial, we want the Chinese feng shui master or the geomancer, they had to face north. That is according to the principle of feng shui, because China is the northern hemisphere.
Well, so that made me think, well, so those stories are gone. The grave marker is gone. I mean, what do they say, that we die twice? Once when we die, and then the second time when people stop saying our name. And looking at the cemetery, it made me think, well, we need to tell that story. And hearing that long, I know I've known him all my life, but when you said, well, obviously it would be long, it would be, and then Debbie Anna Hall was there, and you said that her name would have been a Chinese name. So that so as so often happens, people have anglicised a Chinese name. And so it got me thinking, well, we need to tell that story. And then so the two projects, the book and the memorial, flowed from that. And the sad thing is, when we looked in the cemetery, when we went to the council records, for some names, it had a Chinaman. Like they were the words for that grave. So
Nothing else.
We could not get every name, but it was a case of telling that story. And we always, all of you know that if you're readers, it's the cheapest way to get to know people on earth. So by hearing those stories, it's a wonderful thing.
Actually, St. George at that time is 2,000, it's roughly 2,000. This time, the tourism St. George, we have a breakfast on the 16th of July and ask the same question, what's the population now? The guys told us that in 2021 census is run about 3,000. I said, whoa, there is a jump of 1,000 from 2017 to 2021.
If there's water, there are jobs, and people come to see. Water is gold in that community. So,
All right.
Yeah, and those droughts can really knock country towns around.
For your information, there's only one Chinese restaurant there. One doctor, one dentist, and our former
Chinese pharmacist.
that's right.
Yeah.
Our former Prime Minister Julie Gillard went there in 2011 together with Graham Perrett. They did not pick me out from Sunnybank. When you think of the original Queensland, diversity does not come to mind. Like that, does it in your electorate of Moreton? What was St. George like when you and Wayne were growing up there?
Yeah, there was always that significant First Nations presence of, 15% or so, 15-20%. That's been reasonably steady. For the book, I looked at the referendum results for 1967 just to see what that community decided. So remember, nationwide it was 91%, and St. George was about 80% voted yes. So that would have been my parents would have been voting there then. There was a Chinese presence. So when this year, or a few years ago, when they selected the rugby league team of the century for St. George, the captain was Chinese. So they've always been a significant presence in the community, both as business people and in other ways. So there was a bit of multiculturalism, but Queensland in the 70s was very white bread.
To St. George Park, and one of your friends, or your classmate, is Aboriginal, and she come to see me. I'm Chinese. I got Chinese heritage. Remember?
Debbie Anna Hall for those from St. George.
So not only that, there is
This is someone that Wayne calls the Ballon Beacon because she knows everything in town. Sorry, Wayne. Sorry, Lewis.
And then there's a lady called Auntie Peggy Titeman. She was from the Gundari elders from Mitchell. Mitchell is about 587 kilometers, and St. George is 509 kilometers. I think from St. George to Mitchell is about 1 hour drive.
Yeah.
And she say she have a Chinese blood. And she is First Nation people. I think the grandmother of Auntie Peggy Titeman was born in St. George, come from St. George.
All the good people are.
Grand first published book. What made you want to become a writer?
I've always, I see a few of my colleagues from previous teaching jobs. I was always an English teacher. That was my first job before becoming a lawyer. So I've always loved words and telling stories. I grew up in a family we didn't get television till I was in grade 4, I think. And then it was only the ABC. So we always spoke, yarned, played games. So I like the idea of telling stories, and I think Wayne Long's story is an important story to tell. in the micro and the macro around it.
Something that you want people to take away from this story?
We're in West End, so I can go a cliche. I think, Fiona, that there are great stories. There are so many great stories. The books I read when I was a kid, were all focused on London, and daffodils and the like. That telling a European version of where we were. We should be telling our stories, and Wayne's story is a part of that. So that would be the takeaway, that we've got so many great stories that are Australian stories, and they need to be told. The history books I read of my hometown of St George was called In Mitchell's Footsteps. There's the story of white, we're going to call them explorers, white settlers. Well, Mitchell actually followed the footsteps of people that been walking there for 50,000 years. Yeah, the former Surveyor General of Australia.
Surveyor General.
Yeah.
At that time, I think we don't even have the Queensland yet.
We were still a part of New South Wales. Yeah.
Queensland was formed in 1859.
So we need to tell all of the stories, and we can't find. Sometimes it will only be a Chinaman or a First Nations person, but we should be telling those stories wherever we can. I've done my best to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've asked all my questions. Unless you have any question from the audience, Joanne, we want to. Fiona, can we take any question from the audience?
Sure, we've got time. Got a question here.
Acknowledge, Graham, your honesty in saying that speaking and telling fiction is a lot easier as a politician than speaking fact.
I come back to haunt I never lie to anyone.
I saw your calls going, oh no. Politicise tonight. I was going to say I don't want to, but I do. You have come out and said that you are a proponent of the yes vote. In writing this book, you've given a diaspora in Australia, an important diaspora in Australia that has influenced so many things throughout our history, and given it a voice. How do you see that as leaning towards giving a voice to our other, the Indigenous people in Australia who really need that as well?
The Chinese diaspora doesn't have a mortality rate 10 times worse than the rest of Australian society. The Chinese diaspora doesn't have unemployment rates, incarceration rates, health rates. The Chinese diaspora is doing okay, and the Chinese diaspora would be the first to say they are not the first people here. So the yes vote that we can trot out in October will do two things. It'll recognise that truth, that the First Nations community were deliberately excluded by the white men who wrote that document. Remember, they wrote with race intended to exclude Indians, Chinese, First Nations people. They wrote deliberately, race is in our constitution and was always a factor. So that's why the Chinese diaspora doesn't need to have a voice. The First Nations people need to recognise that truth, but more importantly, what we're doing now is not working. If you've got, if you heard Jason Clare today, if you're in First Nations person, more chance of going to jail than going to university. I mean, that means what we're doing now is not working. So there are lots of bodies that advise government, that make reports to government. I can give you the list of 20 if you want. The government doesn't always take that advice, but we need to get First Nations people into our constitution and at the table, because what we're doing now is not working. Wayne's story is full of people who did not get their story told and had a good story, had potential and hope, and we need to turn that around. That's why I'll be voting yes. LMP Chinese members, they probably would have said the same thing, but they're going to have this forum in September, and hopefully after that they'll come out with a position. But most multicultural groups have said this takes nothing from us. In fact, it makes us stronger as a nation.
That's to see a politician actually interested in Amoy Shepherd. I've been actually looking at it, and most of the descendants from that generation, they actually can't find their ancestor. Like a lot of people are very interested in ancestor finding. This group of people, it's quite a shame that they actually can't find it. It's such an important group of people. Can the government help them in any way?
And the Consul General from China went out to St George. Seven from the the Brisbane Consul General, and that was a point that came up at that event. I might let Lewis add to it, but I think as people find out more, they would, on Ancestry.com, and I know there's problems with many of that harvesting of data, but we will try to find out some of that information. I'm interested in that anyway.
We're still working on it.
Yeah, we're still working on it. Yeah.
Actually, I don't have much information at this stage. I think we are still working on it, Grant, because there are certain information we just couldn't find.
And so that treaty of Nanking, was it, that allowed the movement between Britain and China so that workers could come to Australia despite the racism of some Queenslanders at the time. Although I think the Courier Mail came out in support of Britain because they were so starved of labour. They actually, the Courier Mail of the 1840s, whatever the version was, came out in support of bringing labour here. Labour.
Squatters against the politician.
Yeah. Capital and government. Who would have thought?
People seem to be interested. I'm actually doing a PhD on ethnic minorities that were brought to Moreton Bay in the 1840s and 1850s. So I'm collecting all of the archival documents on the Amoy Shepherds. I already have hundreds of names. And so we need to
Just
talk.
a great dating agency. What's your name, sir?
Jan Richardson.
Jan Richardson, for those at the back. So,
Yeah.
because I imagine there'll be individual stories like a Wayne Long, like that will have DNA that can tell some of those stories as well.
Yes, so I'm already in contact with several descendants of
Okay.
Amoy Shepherds, but I have a database and I'm collecting information, and I'll be finished in early 2025, but I'm more than happy to speak to anyone who's interested.
Well done, Jan. I think you're about to join the Sunnybank speaking circuit very soon.
It's a non-fiction book. Obviously a lot of true and correct research has gone into it. When you were speaking with Wayne, did you tape all that? And if so, how many hours and how much has gone into it as far as research? I mean,
Look, yes, hours and hours of Wayne, and then transcribing it. That's why it took so long, and that's why I hated the process. But I was halfway through before I realised, and then I knew I had to go and interview other people to get a different version of this story, both in Pine Creek up in the Northern Territory and Darwin. Thankfully, the good thing about Canberra is Pat Dodson is a mate of mine, so he's got connections with the Broome part. So I did some cheating by talking to people that they were able to connect me with. But I really was 10 PhDs waiting to be written, but I just wanted to get back to fiction because that's what I love. But yeah, I wouldn't do it again unless there was an incredible subject matter because of that, because it's, I think it's more, you do need like Peter Fitzsimons, you need people doing research for you, compiling it. Doing the groundwork, like it's a long drive to get to Darwin and Pine Creek and all those sorts of things. And my wife's from Cairns, and she was like, why aren't you doing more in Cairns? And I was like, look, one funny thing when I went to, so Atherton, there's a Chinese memorial, a Chinese temple. Okay, so a little bit of history and literature combining here. So Queensland had, I think we had, there's some Labor people here. How many One Nation MPs did we get in 1989? I think it was 13 of them. Or too many, 30. So one of them was, how many, Andrew? 9. So one of them was Rosalie Long. Was that her name?
No, she came in 3 years.
Oh, she came in 3 years after. So she was married to someone, she was Anglo-Saxon, but married to someone Chinese. Okay, so her family was connected with the temple. So when I was up there in Atherton, the brochure for the temple had Rosa dressed up as a Chinese person in the brochure. And that made me think, right, I really have to get this right. That is a fair income story. That is, that dressing up like a Chinese person. Yeah. Phone actually, it is all on my phone. So many, and my home computer. But I'm thinking 40 hours, 50 hours, but sometimes we're just talking shit, like so. And the recorder was going, and you'd be talking about the footy from the night before, because Wayne was living his life, not writing a piece of literature, so we'd talk about all sorts of crap, so then I'd have to, there'd be nuggets would come out along the way, and he'd just say something incidental that would set me off on a whole new direction, so. Yeah.
Very much for coming, and the book is for sale at the counter. Grab a copy now, and then we'll have Wayne at the front signing copies. One more round of applause for Wayne.
Well done. To Alex, A-L-E-X.
The ones who left and went other way.
Yes. Oh, I see it.
The 12 fishes.
Yeah, in 2008.
I should have brought it along with me, got him to sign it.
Yeah.
But anyway, we can do it. I'll just go up the road.